some of the challenges that they face, some of the cultural norms and values that contribute to these challenges, the community dynamics that contribute to these challenges, as well as the systems barriers that contribute. And then responding to this community, right? How can we provide culturally responsive and culturally resilient services? How can we best support this community? If in providing services for gender-based violence. So I do have a PowerPoint. I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen. Okay. So there we have the PowerPoint, and let me just get situated here with my screens. Okay, I think I got it. It's always like a Tetris thing, making sure you can see everything on your screens. Okay, so my organization is called the Asian Pacific Institute on Gender-Based Violence, or API-GBV. We're a national resource center, and we we don't have direct services, so we don't directly support survivors of gender-based violence, but we do provide advocacy, we do technical assistance and training, we develop resources such as fact sheets and reports, and things like that. We have a research department that conducts research studies, as well as, obviously reviews existing research and studies on this topic. We do policy advocacy. We work with organizations that do provide direct services to build their capacity to serve this community, to help them grow their ability and to grow their organizational strength and resilience. So we do that through a lot of training and resource development as well. You can see our website here. We do have a lot of resources on our website. So here are our objectives for today, which I talked about already. We want to be able to identify some of the challenges and barriers affecting AAPI communities and survivors, understand how culturally responsive services are important and meaningful in supporting this community. Think about how this all intersects with everything that's been going on recently. So whether that's, COVID, increased API hate, and other movements, and then learn about some resources. Again, if there's something pressing on your mind, feel free to let me know in the chat if there's something you want to make sure I do address. Little agenda here. So starting with a reflection, just to kind of ground ourselves a little bit, let's think of a time when you made a cultural assumption about someone. You saw them or interacted with them, and then you assumed something about them. And then think of a time when someone else made a cultural assumption about you. And then think about, how did that impact the conversation? How did that impact the situation, the relationship, what was happening at that time? So just take maybe like 30 seconds to reflect. If you feel comfortable and if you would like, go ahead and share that in the chat. But just think on it for a couple of seconds. Brenda says, people assume I am Indian. Yeah, so just looking at you and assuming the culture that you come from or the community that you come from. Yeah. If anyone else wants to share, please do so. But we like to start some of our conversations with this kind of grounding question, because it's a good reminder that not just AAPI people or Asian and Pacific Islander people, but all people from all backgrounds have a culture that they come from, ascribe to community norms and dynamics. and anybody, regardless of where they're coming from, can make assumptions at any point in their, their journey to become more culturally resilient. You can still be making assumptions about people. And anybody can be subject to incorrect assumptions, and that can affect the conversation. It can make things awkward. It can make the person standoffish. Sometimes it has no effect, but it can. And so we're going to be talking a lot about culture today. And I'll talk about this more, but, I'll be talking about how understanding or learning about culture doesn't mean, going and applying what you learn to everybody that belongs to that culture, everybody that looks like they belong to that culture. It still means learning about everybody, every survivor as an individual and their particular needs and their particular experiences. So I'm going to move on and talking about the AAPI community. Here's the assumptions that I just spoke about. So just to ground ourselves a little bit, we want to start from a place where we know that all cultures have values, and that includes American culture. It includes the culture of the community that you live in. It includes that of the family that you grew up in or your own household. So all cultures have values that are oppressive, as well as those that are empowering and those that are nurturing. Each individual is not only a member of their community, but a unique individual with their own responses and beliefs and values. So just because somebody identifies, for instance, as Indian, doesn't mean that, they identify with everything that all other Indians identify with. And it would be impossible for me today, and it would be impossible for anyone to fully describe the diversity and nuances of AAPI cultures. As you'll see, it's an incredibly vast and diverse community, and experiences vary greatly within the community. So I'm going to be saying some things today that are somewhat generalizations, somewhat, using very broad strokes. But just keep that in mind. So when we say the AAPI community, sometimes we refer to it also as the API community. Sometimes folks add the NH for Native Hawaiians, so AANHPI. And I believe that the new term, the new federal, official federal term is AA and PI, so Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, in order to better separate out, or better, to better separate out the Pacific Islanders, and recognizing that, we can't just absorb them within the, the larger Asian group. So on this map here, you'll see a lot of the regions where AAPIs come from. And this is not to say that everybody from one of these regions must identify as AAPI, or that they should identify as AAPI, because identity is something that's self-selected, right? Somebody from one of these regions may not identify as Asian or Pacific Islander at all. They may identify as something else, but often we do see folks from all of these regions that are shaded on the map identifying as Asian or Pacific Islander over other identities. So you can see that it's an incredibly diverse set of backgrounds and incredibly diverse set of languages. And what's not represented is for instance, the religions, beliefs, other things, right? These are all, it's a lot, right? It's a lot of different backgrounds. And so just kind of try to keep that in your mind as we talk today about the diversity that's represented here. So all that to say that if you're thinking about, how do I build cultural resiliency for that population? If your organization provides services or wants to engage this community in any way, we always say it's best to understand who it is in that community in the first place. So the AAPI community in the Bay Area looks very different from the AAPI community in other parts of California, like the Central Valley or Southern California. And I pulled Bay Area statistics specifically today because looking at the participant list, I saw that most folks were from the Bay Area, but I did see that some of you were not from the Bay. So I think it's really important to kind of look and see who is in your area and what are the communities. So in the Bay Area specifically, there's a very significant and growing Asian population in particular, but also a smaller NHPI or Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander population. And of the Asian population, Chinese represent the biggest chunk, followed by Indian and Filipino. And you can see some of the breakdowns there. Within NHPIs, Tongans are the largest community there, kind of halfway down that list there. And of course, you know, if you look at individual cities, if you look at individual areas, even you know, neighborhoods, that all changes too, right? So your city may have a lot of Vietnamese folks, and maybe not at all of Indians. Maybe your city specifically has a lot of Hmong communities. The other thing it's important to look at when you're trying to understand your community is not just obviously the ethnic background, but where are these folks coming from? Are they recent immigrants? Have they been here for many generations? Where do they work? What are their you know, where are they visible in the community? Maybe they're refugees, maybe they're ascribed to a particular religion. So I think it's easy for those of us in the Bay Area to, when we think about Asians in the Bay Area, we're thinking of the folks that work in Silicon Valley, that work at Google or, you know, eBay and things like that. It's probably the first image that jumps to a lot of folks' mind. And in fact, the city that I grew up in, San Jose, did have a significant community of more recent immigrants who do work in, you know, in tech, right? But that's, of course, I mean, you all know that's not where all the AAPIs in the Bay Area are. There are so for instance, in Chinatown, San Francisco or Oakland, there's older immigrants, like older generations of immigrants. Asians, in fact, have been in the Bay Area for, you know, couple hundreds of years, right? There's a Filipino Nurses Association. There's a strong Sikh community in the Bay as well. So learning about your, you know, who is in your community is always important, and not just, you know, painting everybody with a really broad stroke and not just stereotyping folks. If you know who is in your community, feel free to just, you know, shout that out in the chat too. Like, what are the AAPI communities in the area that you serve or in the area that you live? So challenging internal biases is something that's really important. It just all came up. Okay. So on the left here, you'll see some common stereotypes about AAPI people. And on the right side, you'll see, you know, some beliefs or statements that if you believe the stereotypes on the left, it's easy to kind of assume, right? So if you believe that Asian women are submissive, which is a very common stereotype, then you may assume that, you know, it's normal for husbands to control their wives because the wives are supposed to be submissive to the husband, and that might make you miss cases of domestic violence. I've known cases where an Asian woman goes to like a DV services provider and, you know, says, my husband is controlling, my husband's telling me what to do, what to wear, everything like that. And the response that she's met with is, I thought that was pretty normal in your culture for the husband to be more controlling, to be more dominant, which you can imagine how invalidating that made the survivor feel, right? Similarly, AAPI parents spank their children, which, as someone who was spanked as a child, nothing crazy, but, I was spanked for misbehaving as a child. My friends were all spanked. My, Asian friends were all spanked. I think in some communities that's fairly normal and fairly common, but that might make you overlook cases of child abuse if you see an Asian or Pacific Islander child who's been spanked or physically punished, and you think, oh well, I think that's pretty normal. I think that's pretty common for parents to spank their children. It may make you not recognize when severe abuse is happening. AAPI families are tight-knit. I think this is true. I'll talk about this later. A lot of families are very collective and very close to each other, involved in each other's lives, right? So that might make you, if you're like a service provider, think that the survivor would be okay with their family. The survivor's partner is abusing them. Let's suggest that the survivor goes to live with their family or their extended family. They should be safe there. Well, that often sometimes isn't the case, right? In AAPI households, a lot of times the survivor's mother, their father, their aunts, uncles, cousins, can be either perpetrators of abuse or condone the abuse, or they can be part of the emotional kind of abuse and that sort of thing. AAPIs respect their elders. I think that's, oh, shoot, some technical, I clicked on something. Ooh. I don't know why it's doing that. Okay. APIs often do respect their elders, right? Elders are often afforded a certain level of deference and respect. But I think that makes a lot of APS, Adult Protective Services workers, overlook cases of elder abuse or elder neglect. I actually just attended a conference last week where we discussed a lot of these issues, where a lot of times APS is coming in on calls and they're missing cases of elder abuse, partly because of the assumption, the cultural assumption that, well, this, Chinese people respect their elders or something like that, and they would never abuse this elderly person. And AAPIs are all about communities. So I think often that's true. There's very tight-knit and strong community networks. But similar to the family thing, if that can hide the fact that the community often is not a source of protection or support. The community is often a source of abuse, victim blaming, victim shaming, or other potential dangers. So I think it's important to continue to challenge internal biases, and it's not just a one and done, but it's something that is should be constant in everybody's lives, right? Everybody has internal biases, and everybody is making judgments just naturally as a human all the time. And to keep pushing back against those, because it can lead to missing cases of abuse. So I'll talk about culture and community and how AAPI cultures often show up and how they impact survivorship and how they impact abuse. So I'm sure you've seen this all before, the power and control wheel in the middle there. And I think the reason this graphic is so important is because it contextualizes power and abuse. Power and what is it, power and control wheel, really only talks about violence, partner violence in the context of that relationship, in that individual, like person to person, right? And we know that violence is something that's affected by the institutions where that couple lives, the society that culture lives in, the community, the culture, right? Norms, religion, institutions, everything. So just to contextualize it. So some of the really important historical context for Asian and Pacific Islander communities, and it's important to recognize, is the context of historical trauma and generational trauma. For different communities, this can look very different. But for instance, colonization as of the Pacific Islands, as of Hawaii or India, as has happened to many places, not just to API areas. Colonization was something that, you know, occurred in the past, and its effects still occur today. I mean, you can even make the argument that it's still happening today, right? But today what it leaves behind is the fetishization and exotification of women for AAPI folks, right? The idea that Pacific Islanders and Native Hawaiians are just these exotic women who, you know, lay on the beach and dance and eat coconuts or something like that, right? Exotifying that, that traditional culture, for instance. Similarly, historical oppression and forced assimilation, which often comes from colonization. So what that means, or what that looked like was, you know, forcing the people who were colonized to participate in American culture or American, you know, ascribe to American values. I have spoken to Native Hawaiians whose grandparents or whose parents were physically punished publicly in the streets for speaking their language or for practicing their cultural or religious beliefs, because at the time they were expected to just be American, so they weren't allowed to speak their language in the schools. It wasn't taught, and you can imagine the silencing that leads to and the effects that has throughout the generation. These are cultures where they place a high value on their elders, like I talked about before, and the elders are supposed to teach culture and values to the younger generations, teach things about what healthy relationships are. And that's been interrupted as a result of historical forced assimilation. So what that does is it suppresses or replaces certain norms or cultures. And some of these norms and cultures can be ones that are very valuable, right? Very, very beautiful or powerful, such as welcoming third genders, welcoming two-spirit people, such as certain feminist traditions that are no longer practiced, all giving way to the dominant US mainstream culture. A lot of communities have experienced state violence. They've experienced civil war. For instance, Bangladesh and Myanmar have experienced civil war, and folks from those countries have come to the US as refugees as a result of the state violence and the civil war. But through the experience of that violence, they learned to believe that you know, the state was not on their side. The state was not there to protect them. The government was not there to protect them. Military and law enforcement were dangerous, and military and law enforcement were abusers, right? Were those who committed violence against civilians. In state violence, in wartime, we see over and over again, not just in, you know, Asia and the Pacific Islands, rape used as a tool of war. And I really want to stress here that, you know, when women and girls, which is often, you know, the victims of this, when they're sexually assaulted in, you know, during war, it's not because it's not just a byproduct, right? It's not just an accident and they were also sexually assaulted. It is used as a deliberate means to control the population, to strike fear in the populations. It's used deliberately as a tool of war. Many communities have also experienced displacement and refugee resettlement. So the Vietnamese community, I know there's a very strong Vietnamese community in San Jose, in that area where I grew up. The Hmong, Cambodians, and then most recently the Afghan refugees, who I believe that a good portion of them have resettled in California, I think. And you know, when folks become refugees, often it's not, they leave the home country, they leave their home and they immediately resettle in the US, right? It's often they go to a refugee camp in the home country, maybe they go to a refugee camp in a third country, then they come to the US, there's another refugee camp, maybe there's more than one, and then finally they find a home. A lot of folks are still in that process. A lot of folks are still haven't been reunited with their families back in Afghanistan, and this can create a lot of historical trauma for folks. And a lot of times sexual assault does occur in refugee camps as well, from the you know, folks who are supposed to run the camps. So all of these things, the consequences, trickle through the generations of the communities that experience them. As I shared earlier, a lot of these cultures, I mean, I think all cultures, right, learn things from their elders, learn things from the previous generations. But what a lot of these violence does is it interrupts that course of learning. And instead, a lot of times, bad things are passed through the generations. The cycle of violence is passed through the generations. Abuse is passed. Okay. So I'll talk about some of the norms and cultural dynamics that show up across a lot of AAPI cultures. And I don't want to keep saying this, but I am you know, generalizing to some degree, but I think these are also norms that have shown up, that do show up in a lot of cultures. Again, keeping in mind that all cultures are different, all communities are different, and you know, it can look very different in each community. So I think a lot of folks have probably heard that AAPIs are a very collective culture, but what does that really mean, right? Collective in AAPI cultures means that you're supposed to think of not only yourself, or not just yourself, but the family first. What will my actions mean for my family? And what will my actions mean for the community? So I've heard folks talk about collectivism not only as a self versus family, and making sure that the family's needs and the family's desires are put above the self, but I've also heard them talk about it as like the family unit versus the community. So the family unit is supposed to put the community's needs and the community's values above that of that individual family. So there's different levels to collectivism that I've heard described. And it also, collectivism also means that you know, your family, your parents, your extended family can be in every aspect of your, you know, what you might consider your personal business. There's a lot of blurred boundaries in AAPI, you know, households, with, you know, people feeling like they, you know, have a say in what somebody does, what somebody looks like, and things like that. And I think in terms of acculturation, that can be very challenging for especially younger people who are not used to that, or who look on TV or look at their friends and they don't see that same thing. Collectivism can be harmful, right, for people who don't fall into what their family or their community wants. It can be very harmful for survivors. But collectivism can also be very powerful, very strong in the healing that, that can happen when the community is involved, and other things like that. So, it's both. But something to keep in mind is, for a survivor of violence who's coming from an AAPI community, we talk a lot about survivor-centered advocacy, right? Making sure the survivor's at the center of every decision that's made, of every choice that's being offered. The survivor's at the driver's seat of their healing journey. How does that look in a community that's collective, where the family wants to be involved, or the survivor wants the family to be involved? It can be a challenge, I think. Some gender roles that you see a lot in AAPI households is masculine virtues versus feminine virtues, right? Masculine, so boys and men are expected to be decisive, they're expected to be strong, they're expected to be in control. It's okay if they're a little aggressive, because that's just what, men and boys are, right? That's the saying. But overall, they're supposed to be strong. For women and girls, they're supposed to be patient. They're supposed to be gentle and accommodating. They're supposed to not speak too much or not speak too loudly, and kind of give way to the men in their lives. I think that's common across a lot, but not all AAPI communities. And then if you think about what happens if you're a man or a young boy who doesn't embody a lot of these traditional masculine virtues, what if they embody some feminine virtues? How might that family or community react to them? Or think about somebody who doesn't identify as male or female, and has, more masculine virtues, more feminine virtues, or both, and how the family and the community might respond to them. Males are expected to be the heads of the household, whether that's the father, whether that's the husband or the son. So what that means is, a lot of times I've heard a lot of Asian women say that as a woman, I was born into my father's household, and then I got married and I went to my husband's household. And then after my husband died, I'm in my son's household. And that's just how a lot of Asian women have lived their lives, in the households of men, essentially. Pureness is expected, and that means sexually. Sexual pureness is expected as a virtue, especially of women, not so much of men. So if you're a woman and you're no longer pure, you're considered unwanted by a lot of communities. And again, not all, but by a lot of communities, you are seen as unwanted. So there's a lot of stigma against premarital sex. Again, more for women than for men. I see Brenda saying in the chat that often families are the mediators for conflict management in the relationship, which can be internalizing abuse and domestic violence in so many Asian cultures. Yeah, and that's absolutely true, right? So a lot of times when there is violence in the household, you're supposed to, your family is the one that's supposed to figure it out within that family, rather than being able to seek help from outside sources. Yeah, and then machismo, I always have trouble with that word, or is it machismo, is normalized, it's expected, and in some cultures it's actually desired for a man to be like very macho and very kind of aggressive, even assertive, at least. I've heard Asian, well, in this case, there was a Pacific Islander man talk about how for men in his community, because they're expected to be very manly, you know, have the very masculine virtues, they're expected to always just be interested in sex. And so in situations when a partner is wanting, you know, to have sex with them, a man feels or this particular man felt that he felt pressured to have sex because as a man he should want it, and if he said no, that would be weird, that would be unmanly. And so he's let me know that he has kind of given in to that. But if you think about consent, the concept of consent and enthusiastic consent that we teach, often we teach it to young women, right? Consent, no means no, but what does it mean in this situation where the man is feeling pressure to participate in sexual acts because he feels like that's what he should do as a man, or he'll be looked at weirdly. More family dynamics. So I talked about how boundaries are blurred in tight families. You know, people talk about how when they were kids, their parents never knocked on their door to walk in. In fact, often there was no door because you just lived with your family in a big household. Everybody, you lived with your sisters in the same room, or you shared a room with your aunt or your uncle and things like that. Relationships are very hierarchical, and deference or obedience is expected if you're not in a position of power. So in AAPI households, the parents have, you know, are expect obedience from the children. So you're not supposed to question what your parent says. You're not supposed to talk rudely to your parents. And then the same goes for the parents to the grandparents, right? Sometimes that's the same. There are very strict expectations of children. Sometimes or often these expectations differ if you're a boy or if you're a girl. And sometimes these expectations can even differ depending on which order you were born in. So a lot of times firstborn daughters have more strict expectations than their younger siblings. Sometimes firstborn sons have more strict expectations than their younger brothers. Family units are intergenerational. So, you know, aunts, uncles, cousins, grandparents all live in the same house often. And a lot of times they split time between the US and the home country. So I had a lot of friends growing up, Asian friends whose father or mother would spend routinely summers in the home country in the Philippines or in Vietnam, or spend 6 months in the home country. And then, you know, they would bring their grandparents to the US for half the year, and then they'd go back to the home country for the other half of the years. Fairly common. In marriage and religion, so in AAPI cultures, women are expected to be married. Something that a Hmong advocate said to me that really stuck with me is, she said, as a Hmong girl, my purpose was to get married and have kids. So her parents never, you know, stressed school, never stressed education or career or anything like that, because her purpose in life, they felt, was to get married and have children. If you are a woman who is not married, especially at a certain age, like late 30s or 30s, maybe late 20s and older, or if you're a woman who was married and divorced, often you're seen as undesirable and unwanted. Women are expected to keep the family together, right? That's the most important thing for a lot of these cultures, is that you don't get divorced, you don't leave your partner, you don't leave your children, you don't break up the family. And so it's very difficult for a survivor to leave the relationship or even to seek help outside of the relationship. Widows are undesirable. often widows are shunned. A lot of, in some cultures, when a husband dies, the widow is expected to mourn him for the rest of her life, whether that means she wears black or white. It can mean that she avoids eating meat for the rest of her life, certain prayers, things like that. She's expected to kind of mourn the husband and definitely not get married again for the rest of her life. And that's not really the same for widowers. So for men who whose wives have died, those same expectations aren't placed upon them. You can see in this quote, in certain cultures, or in this case, specifically the Hmong culture, a lot of them believe that when a woman gets married, her soul belongs to her husband and to his family. And so you can imagine that if they get divorced, they no longer have their identity. They no longer have their soul in their body, and nobody wants to marry a woman with no soul and no identity. Regarding sex and relationships, these are things that are absolutely supposed to be private. You discuss it only within the couple. Sometimes you don't even discuss it within the couple because you don't have the language, you don't have the words or the norm to discuss these things because you were never taught how to discuss these things. It's very shameful to bring up your sex life or your relationship with others. Youth are not taught what is sexual health, what is relationship health, what does a good relationship look like. You may have heard that Asians aren't very expressive physically expressive of love. There's like a couple of like social media trends going on where it's Asian children or Asian young adults basically saying that their parents never showed love, but their parents would bring them food, right? And that to them from their parents, that's how Asian parents show love, which I think is true. And there are different ways to show love, but I think it's very difficult for children to be growing up and seeing how love is shown on TV in the US versus how their parents show love and not understanding, right? So not understanding what a healthy relationship looks like and not being able to apply that to their own relationships and not having anybody to talk to about it because their parents might get mad at them for dating or their parents don't feel comfortable talking about it to them. Asian women are definitely expected to be more caregiving, yeah, and as glue to the family. Definitely, yeah. So I mean, women, in a lot of cultures, the household is kind of the purview of the woman, and if there's a breakdown of the relationship, of the relationship with the children, that's considered her fault. Yeah, food as the love language, right? So here you'll see, we call this graphic or infographic the lifetime spiral of gender violence. It is on our website and it actually has been translated into 20-something AAPI languages. And I think it's a really useful tool to visualize the violence, the gender violence that an AAPI person may experience over the course of their life. And that's starting at infancy and sometimes even before infancy, all the way through adulthood and all the way through elderhood, I guess. And you can imagine that each experience with violence will impact future experiences with violence. And the other thing to note is that, I mean, I think it's just important to keep in mind that violence isn't just a one-time occurrence. It happens and then it's done. It can happen over the course of somebody's life. It can involve more than one abuser. Sometimes a person is experiencing more than one type of violence at the same time. So we'll move on from that. But I do want to stop now about halfway through the presentation to see if there's any questions or reflections about something that you heard or something that you saw. I'm going to pause for maybe 30 seconds and give you a chance to ask your questions if you have them. And feel free to also unmute yourselves too. Yeah, we will be sharing the slides. And you can also find this on our website, this particular thing.
Sorry, there is a question in the chat. So Michelle asked, what is version cleansing?
Cleansing. So I'm not super familiar with it, but I understand it to be a form of state, like state violence or violence during wartime, where, as like I talked about before, rape being used as a tool of war. So, you know, basically cleansing the population of virgins through sexual assault, right? Just like a tool of fear and intimidation. If that makes sense. Okay. Barriers to help seeking. So I'll talk about, you know, keeping all those cultural factors in mind. What makes it difficult for an AAPI person to reach out for help? If you look at studies, especially big national studies conducted by, for instance, the CDC or other like big research entities, you'll see that rates of violence for AAPI communities is low compared to the rates of violence in other ethnic groups. And I think what that does is it hides the issue. It leads to the assumption that there's not violence in our communities. And that's just not true, right? We know anecdotally, and we know from some of our studies that that's not true. But what contributes to that is that there's a lot of underreporting of services, underreporting of violence, and then underutilization of services. So AAPI survivors are not reporting violence that's happened to them, whether that's to law enforcement or service providers or studies and surveys. We also see that AAPI folks underutilize services across the board, not only DVSA services, but health screenings, mental health services, social services, and all of these things. And again, that invisibilizes the issue, right? Makes you think that there's not a lot of violence happening. I see a question in the chat about how we approach victims to open up, and that's a great question. I think it's really important to talk about, and I will address it. I have a couple slides later on. First of all, there's a lot of silencing and there's a lot of shame of survivorship of violence. For a lot of folks, they get the impression that being the survivor of abuse is more shameful than being the perpetrator of abuse. So a lot of times when somebody is found to have abused someone, they might say, the community or their family might say, well, it's because his wife, and often, you know, I'm using him and her because that is how it often shows up, is a man abuses his wife. His family says, well, she wasn't doing her job as a wife. She made him mad, right? She did something that wasn't good enough and made him angry, and it's okay that he's kind of punishing her for that. A lot of times in cases of sexual assault, I mean, we've all heard it. It's like, you know, boys will be boys. It's, you know, he made a mistake, that sort of thing. But for the survivors of violence, often it that follows them through their lives, right? In these tight-knit communities where everybody knows everybody, people whisper, people say like, oh, did you know, that person, do you know what happened to them? If they're a survivor of sexual assault, often that makes them undesirable for marriage because they've lost, you know, their so-called pureness, right? Often this affects not only them, but their family. You know, did you hear like this family over there? Did you hear what happened to their daughter? That sort of thing. And so it's very shameful, and people don't want to speak out about abuse that's happened to them. There is a lot of shame of needing help, right? I've heard a lot of AAPI folks speak about the so-called the wholeness of the family, in that you're supposed to be perfect. You compare yourself with others. Everybody knows about the lives of everybody else. And if you need help, whether that's like from DVSA services or social services, mental health, things like that, it's because you're not whole. It's because you're not good enough. And it's shameful to need help. For young people, you know, a lot of AAPI young people weren't allowed to date, weren't allowed to drink, weren't allowed to party. And so they don't want to ask their parents for help if there's a red flag in their relationship, because, you know, their parents might say, well, were you drinking? Were you dating? Why are you dating? There's a lot of distrust and fear from previous interactions. I've talked about state violence before and violence in refugee camps. So because of that, there's a lot of distrust of law enforcement. And there's a lot of distrust of like social services and what that'll mean for me and my family if I have a record of having access to social services. A lot of folks don't even know what help means. So if I approach a shelter and I ask, you know, and I say I've been a victim of abuse and I ask for services, does that mean a case will be opened against me and my partner will be arrested and thrown in jail and my children will be taken away? This is a legitimate fear for a lot of survivors, is they don't understand, you know, what happens if they call the police, or what happens if they report that violence has happened to them. They often think that there's just going to be a huge like court case and, you know, that sort of thing, which, you know, these are not unfounded beliefs or assumptions either. Our systems in the United States are incredibly complex. Our justice system is very complex. Our immigration system is very complex. And a lot of immigrants or not immigrants just don't understand what will happen, right? That's why, I mean, you need a lawyer, right, to be able to parse through some of these things. And a lot of folks expect that the service provider isn't going to understand their culture. If there's no culturally responsive services in the area, they may be afraid that, you know, yeah, public charge is still a huge issue. Especially, I think the most recent development was they rejected the final rule, which is more protective of immigrants. We've done a survey of service providers, which found that a majority of immigrant survivors would rather live with the abuse than report it because they're afraid of getting deported. They're afraid of, you know, law enforcement or whatever. And a lot of folks are afraid of accessing services because they're going to be deemed a public charge, and, you know, that'll affect their immigration status. So the wider societal context of the increased fetishization, racism, and hate against AAPI populations has affected how willing folks are to leaving their home, to reporting violence, and to seeking help for violence. And I want to stress that AAPI hate is something that's not new. It's something that's existed as far back as AAPI people have existed in this country. So it's not new at all, but it is growing, or it has been growing as a result of COVID, or it has looked a little different as a result of COVID. and it has gained more attention as a result of COVID. And so AAPI people, especially Asian people, are more afraid than ever of seeking help outside of their immediate community and their immediate family. So I think what all that contributes to is the idea that there's not a lot of violence that's happening in AAPI households, right? The model minority myth tells us that all Asians are successful, we're all doctors and engineers and lawyers, and make a lot of money and live suburban happy lives. And that contributes to people not wanting to reach out because they're afraid of being stereotyped. And they don't see other AAPI people who have reached out. And so that further kind of pushes their story back, pushes their story. They want to hide their story. So I want to bring up this case, which happened 2015, I want to say, somewhere around there is when this case came out. I could be completely off base, but some of you may know about it. Naya Rastogi was employed by Apple. Her husband was employed by, I forget the name of the company, but it's a tech, like a tech Silicon Valley company, a smaller one. And she had at that time opened up about her abuse that she experienced in her marriage. She actually recorded a couple of audio clips of the abuse happening. And it was a very kind of powerful moment for a lot of Indian, Indian American or immigrant people in the Bay Area, in really shining a light on some of what happens, because on the surface these are very successful people, they're very well off, he's fairly mild-mannered in public, and nobody would expect, right, the model minority myth, nobody would expect that this is actually happening behind closed doors, so to speak. And I think that, again, it contributes to a lot of the silencing, because she spoke about how she hid it because she didn't want it to mar that image of the perfect family that they had. Talking about barriers again, right? So if you think about all the barriers to help seeking, and then the intersecting identities that can make things even more difficult for somebody. A lot of AAPI families and communities, unfortunately, are still unwelcoming of people who are LGBTQ, people who are gender fluid. There's a lot of isms that are still present within the community. There's, classism, ableism, right? Stigma against mental illness is huge in the community. Not understanding that mental illness is illness and thinking it's just weakness is something that's still very prevalent. And so for folks who are survivors who are experiencing violence and also belong to one of these identities or struggle with mental illness or substances, it's even more difficult for them to be able to reach out for help. Again, because they're afraid, because they don't have a supportive family, first of all, and they're also afraid that if they reach out, then all of this is going to get out about them. Their whole family is gonna, or their whole community is gonna find out about, their mental illness, or they're gonna be outed, things like that. So I want to pose, I guess, this question to the chat. Is knowing all this, what are some strategies or approaches that you might use to respond to an AAPI person who is afraid or hesitant to disclose that they're experiencing violence? How might you interact with this person? Any ideas? And it doesn't have to be an AAPI person either. I think, anybody, regardless of background, can be hesitant to say, hey, I'm a survivor, right? I was abused. How might you talk to that person?
First of all, I just want to say thank you. All this information that you're offering is just so eye-opening. Just to realize that all these, expectations within the culture can make it very difficult for a person with mental illness or experiencing domestic violence to even acknowledge or not acknowledge, but realize that they're going through this, and then further to even reach out for help. But I think that going back to your question is just talking to them about it, just bringing up the topics. Sometimes we suspect that these things are going on, or we actually know that these things are going on because we've seen reports from, other providers. So we know that these issues exist, but they're not going to disclose. So just maybe even bringing up the topics, just in general, right? Maybe this is a topic that I talk with all my clients, and then trying to normalize it, or letting them know that this is very common. Mental illness is an illness, but it's very common, and there's help. Or a lot of women experience domestic violence, and you're not alone, there's help. So I guess just starting there of just, especially just talking to everyone, what is a healthy relationship? That kind of really stuck out for me, because that they don't even know what a healthy relationship is because they've never seen it, right? And that just applies to everything. If you grew up and you don't see these things modeled, or saw these positive things in your home, how do you expect someone to know what a healthy relationship is? Or that spanking, I was spanked too, or I was more than spanked, but just even realizing now that is, or can turn into child abuse, So I guess just talking about these things in a more general way to let people know that this is it, this exists, it's a problem, but there's help, you're not alone.
Thank you for sharing. Yeah, I mean, I think that's the base of it, right? Is just having a conversation with them and learning about their experience, letting them talk about their experience, and then kind of educating at the same time about what a healthy relationship is. And I think it does take time to kind of build that trust and that rapport for someone to be able to disclose. Thank you. Any other quick thoughts about this? We will be talking a little bit more about this in the next section.
Certainly. I think confidentiality is one of the things that we have to really practice when it comes to Asian culture, because we do come from a very, I'm saying we, because I also belong to one of the Southeast Asian communities. So we do come from a very close-knit circle of people. Everybody knows everybody's business, like we said, and practicing confidentiality and letting them know, hey, I know your situation, and I'll keep it confidential, and I'm being professional here. And there are different systems that work and that are in the place that is different from what from the origin of the country that we come from. So abuse is not private matters just here, it's also an abuse. It's also violence is taken as violence here. So it's unlawful, not just unlawful, not just your private matters. So having that educational moment of what is the difference between the country of origin, their culture, and what is out here, how do system take it as, is also like giving that lens, looking from the lens of what it is to be US citizen, let's say, what it is to be here in Richmond, or being in a space where abuse is taken as violence.
Yeah,
would help.
Definitely. Yeah, and to that point, I heard somebody talk about, at the conference last week that I went to, someone was sharing about how for elderly survivors, like these are folks who've experienced abuse for decades from the same partner that they were married to. they've seen a couple of cases where there's a moment when APS is called and APS comes to the home and finds out about the abuse. And this person has, because they've been abused for decades, they've thought about, leaving, they've thought about getting help, things like that, but they've never done it because of the shame, because of the stigma, because of whatever. But because in this situation, APS has come and APS has started a case, they have felt relieved because it feels legitimate now. It isn't just something in their heads. They feel validated and they feel like, okay, well, it's in the law's hands, it's out of my hands. And so it almost feels like a relief for them. And I think it's kind of to what you were speaking about, is that, a lot of them don't understand the laws here, right? That it's not okay. And in certain situations, it can help to say like, hey, this is not something that's allowable in the US. But also to explain what that means, right? What does it mean when there's going to be a protection order? What does it mean and what does it not mean? And here's the choices that you will have to make along the way, that sort of thing, just explaining the situation. I see for someone who is hesitant to speak or ask for help, there are resources, let them know there are resources and support available. Try to be empathetic to the person in the situation they're coming from. Be cautious of trying to force having a conversation if they're hesitant, and be receptive to the person when the person does begin to ask for help. So letting them know what the options are and what the resources are, but not saying you have to do this or you have to do that, and not pushing too hard and letting them open up and share whatever they're comfortable with. So thank you for sharing that, and keep typing if you have other ideas. But I'm going to talk about more about this and kind of like how we might interact or approach or support an AAPI person who, knowing some of what they may be experiencing culturally and knowing that they may be hesitant to reach out for help at each of these 4 points. So I think I might have to go kind of fast through this, just looking at the time. But when you're meeting somebody, I think this works better in like a in-person group, because sometimes we have people go into breakout rooms and talk about this, or like talk with your partner about this, but I'll just make do with virtual. So when you meet somebody, what are some things that you might want to consider or that you might want to ask about? So yeah, meeting them where they are. We talked about, confidentiality is big, right? Making sure that they know what you're not going to share and what you have to share. If you're like a mandated reporter, or if there's certain things that you do have to share with other agencies or within your agency. I'm just going to bring up some other ideas, but keep typing them in the chat if you have ideas, like what other considerations or other questions might you need to consider. So first of all, where are you meeting this person, right? Are you meeting them? Are they coming right into your center? Or is it like a table that you're doing in the community or another community event? And I say this because we've noticed that for a lot of AAPI culturally responsive service providers, DVSA agencies, they say that a lot of times they don't encounter survivors because the survivors are walking through the door and saying, I'm a survivor and I need shelter. A lot of times they do a lot of like cultural events. They do food pantries, cultural events, like ESL classes, things like that. And they notice the same person who keeps coming back. And the same person is, taking the ESL class or, cooking class or whatever, and learns that the center also has DVSA services. And slowly, as they keep coming back and they're building a relationship with the advocates there, and they're feeling trust and they're feeling comfortable, they eventually disclose, can I come to your DV support group too? Things like that. So all that to say, sometimes the trust is built very slowly, and the first encounter with somebody isn't going to be the time that they disclose. Also keep in mind who is nearby. So if it is like a, community event, there could be their partners could be nearby, their family members could be nearby, their friends. And just because somebody is with their child doesn't mean that it might be safe to talk to that person. If you're a medical provider or mental health services provider, a lot of times survivors will come in with a family member, with a mother-in-law, or with a child. And a lot of times that person may seem supportive, but they may be contributing to the abuse too. Working with strengths, yeah, learning about somebody and their values and things like that. And then making sure that translating and interpreting is available and they know that it's available is important too. Excuse me. So talking about disclosure and intake, think about how you're screening for abuse. If you're a healthcare provider, are you screening for abuse? Social services, are you screening for abuse? And keeping in mind that a lot of languages don't have terms for DBSA, gender-based violence, marital rape. They may refer to it indirectly as other things. So they may not resonate with these terms, or they may not even have these specific terms. Thinking about who is harming, it often is the partner, but it also can be sisters, mothers. Heard a lot of stories of a survivor who finally reaches out for help and all of her family turns on her. So her mothers, her cousins, her aunts push her out of the family and either justify the harm, or maybe they're doing emotional, verbal abuse, things like that. And then also thinking about, excuse me, if this is their first time reaching out for help, if they reached out for help before, and if something bad happened, if they didn't get the help that they wanted, that can make them standoffish. What are some things you might have to consider when you're doing providing services or giving safety planning, or making a safety plan, I should say? Oh, sorry. What are some considerations?
I mean, always is just checking in to see if it's safe, if there's no one else around. We're talking about a safety plan would make the situation worse. Making sure asking for permission, or if it's okay to leave any kind of resource numbers for the client. I had a case one time where I couldn't do that, so she wrote the number on her hand and she memorized it because it was not safe to leave anything behind. So just always, I guess, checking for safety before you're going to discuss any kind of resources, services, or safety planning with the client.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. I mean, sometimes you do have to, learn about what's safe for them in their particular situation. And then sometimes getting a little creative or resourceful with how you provide the information. Understanding their sense of safety. So what's safe to you or to other clients you have had may not be the same thing as what's safe to this person, right? Going to their mother's house may not be safe. Going to church may not be safe. Going to work may not be safe. So just things to think about: confidentiality and privacy. Yeah, very important. Everybody knows everybody, and word gets around. Even if you have an interpreter or a translator for this person, if it's a small, tight-knit community, if it's a language that not a lot of people speak, there's a chance that they might know the interpreter or translator. And if the interpreter or translator is not properly abiding by the, what the confidentiality agreements that they have, they the interpreter goes home and tells his wife, his kids, it could get around. So these are just some things to consider. And just kind of understanding where each person is and the needs that they have. I mean, it's, it's, again, it's not just for AAPIs, it's for all survivors, right? But for AAPI folks in particular, some other forms of violence that may also be happening in their lives. It's important to also screen for these things as well. Forced marriage, child marriages, honor violence, female genital cutting or mutilation, right, are all things that can co-occur with domestic violence or sexual assault, human trafficking, elder abuse. What about for long-term healing? What are some of the considerations for long-term healing? I think I'll just click through it because I'm looking at time. So they may not want to engage with the justice system, right? In fact, we know that a lot of survivors don't want to engage with the justice system. They don't want their partner arrested. They don't want to go to court. I mean, I don't think anybody wants to go to court. They don't want their kids potentially be taken away. They just want the abuse to stop, and they just want to feel safe in their own homes and in their own bodies. Think about the tools that you're using. If you use the power and control wheel, if you use other like visual tools, do those resonate culturally with the person that you're using them with? So for instance, the power and control wheel, we've heard from Pacific Islander communities that doesn't resonate. It doesn't fully capture their experiences or their cultures, right? Their communities. And so are there other tools? Can you work with the community to create a tool? Can you work with the survivor to kind of adapt a tool or a process that works for them? And then what might they need in the long term? And is the family involved, right? So I think for a lot of AAPI people, they do want the family. You can't heal the person without healing the family in collectivist cultures, in families where everybody is affected to some degree by the abuse, and in situations where they don't want to leave the partner. They still love that person. They still want to be with that person. You have to involve the family in the healing process. Talking about culturally responsive services, you have to talk about language access. There's a very significant portion of the AAPI community that is limited English proficient, is limited English proficient, sorry. And making sure that you have a language access plan, you have interpreters, translators when needed. It can be difficult because a lot of times, for some languages, there may be a lot of speakers. For some languages, there can be very few speakers, and it can be very difficult to find an interpreter or a translator. But as much as you can, as much as you can, try not to rely on Google Translate. I know that sometimes it's the only thing you have, and it's better than nothing, but it doesn't come close to a real interpreter. If there's a language line, if there's a agency in your area that serves survivors who speak that language, they may have a bilingual advocate, or they may have interpreters or translators that would be willing to work with you. I've talked about how the survivor could know the interpreter or translator, so be mindful, if possible, redact names on documents that are being translated so they don't go out. And then also important to think about in interpretation translating is that, there's direct translation, but there's also making sure that you're speaking at literacy level. You're not being too academic, you're not being too formal with your terminology. It's all part of language access as well. So we do have a team who works with organizations on building language access plans and making sure there's compliance with Title VI in language access. And so, feel free to reach out to me. I can put you in contact with them if you want to talk more about language access and you want to learn more about being linguistically accessible. But I do apologize that I'm going quickly through this very important topic. I don't think we have time to really do a longer reflection, but just kind of think a little bit about, if you identify as AAPI or if you don't identify as AAPI, either way, if there's anything you heard today that resonated with you and the community that you live in or grew up in. We did this training with a agency where there was a lot of Hispanic advocates and Hispanic communities that they served. And everybody was saying that, you're speaking about AAPI people, but we all have a lot of the same things in our Hispanic homes too, like the collectivism, the, no boundaries, that sort of thing, intergenerational. So I'm sure I've said something today that even if you're not an AAPI person, you can identify with and you've also experienced. And that can be a bridge, right? Just because I'm an AAPI person doesn't mean I understand what all other AAPI people experience. And so I have to, there's always going to be a cultural gap. There's always going to be a cultural divide. And I think one of the strengths that we can draw on is using similar experiences and bridging that divide and understanding. Yeah, Google translation is, can sometimes lead to more confusion than help, definitely. I want to share this this message from a advocate who was sharing that the difference it made when they stopped just approaching their meetings with the form, like, what's your name? How old are you? What happened to you, right? Like all the questions, the checklist of questions. When you actually sit down with somebody and take the time to learn and let them just share what happened to them in their own words, at their own pace, that is very powerful for them in being able to tell their stories how they want to. And it's also very powerful in being able to make that connection, the advocate survivor connection, and ultimately build more rapport and more trust. Lastly, so I talked a lot about, different things that show up in different AAPI cultures or across many AAPI cultures, but, just keep in mind that when we say cultural competence, we don't mean we just learn everything we can about Asian or Pacific Islander people and then say like, okay, well, you're a Chinese person, therefore you must be X, Y, and Z, and I know how to approach you and I know what you want. Definitely not, right? It's about learning what somebody might experience, but also learning about them as an individual, each person. Cultural competence is not one thing that you achieve and then you're done and you don't have to worry about it anymore. It's always learning and relearning. And that's why, we had the reflection in the beginning where people are always making cultural assumptions about other people. It's just something you can't avoid. But being aware of that and being constantly ready to learn is important. Culture, finally, is not a justification for violence, right? There's a lot of things in AAPI cultures and all cultures that lead to violence, but cultures can be changed. Cultures can grow, and we don't ever want to let cultures justify violence. So with 2 minutes left, I do want to share these resources. Like I said, we have a lot on our website and we'll share the slides with you so you can actually click on these links. But I want to see if there's any questions in the next 2 minutes, or you can use my email there to reach out to me. Not seeing any questions, which is perfectly okay. I think I know I gave a lot of info today, so I hope you kind of sit with it, chew on it, and feel free to contact me if anything, if any questions do arise, if you want to chat more, or want to see what other trainings or resources we have.
Thank you so much, Shirley, for this very explanatory presentation. I would say it was very unique presentation. We don't often see people going all in with the topics, and thank you for bringing all topics, touching it swiftly. It was discussed, and thank you all for being here and having this discussions, and most important discussions, because we do have big Asian population and PI community here. And we often do not have resources that is culturally appropriate to our folks. And even when referring clients, we do have that part of gap between system and what our communities need, for that matter. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Shirley. Thank you, everyone. Please feel free to reach out if anything you have heard about abuse. Please feel free to refer clients to Family Justice Center. I am one of the multilingual navigator here. Thank you, everyone, and have a happy Friday.
Happy Friday, yeah.